Good afternoon and welcome to today's assembly. Between 1346 and 51, 25 million people died across Europe due to plague. Between 1348 and 9, the Black Death destroyed a quarter of the population of England, and in 1664 to 5, the Great Plague in London killed about 50,000, about 1 in 5. As we know, today we live in a global society. In the matter of a few hours we can travel across the world. Technology can connect us with friends or family in other countries as effectively as if they were in the next room. We no longer eat according to the seasons or because of what is grown nearby, because food can be transported across the globe 365 days a year. And it's likely that many of you will travel or live in different parts of the world in years to come. The possibilities we have in order to lead exciting, fruitful lives are seemingly endless. However, it wasn't always that way. Most of our ancestors didn't travel far from their birthplaces through their lives, and until 2 generations ago, when my mother-in-law's family settled in Sussex, generations had lived and worked and died in part of Derbyshire. Nearby was the village of Eyam, spelt E-Y-A-M, and going back nearly 400 years to the 17th century, it was prosperous because of the lead that was mined from the limestone cliffs in the area. However, in the autumn of 1665, when Chigwell School was just 36 years old, a consignment of cloth was delivered to an Eyam tailor, George Vickers, from London. A journey that might take us 3 hours in the car up the M1, but would have taken several days by horse and carriage then. Pleased with his delivery, the tailor opened the box that it was contained in, but found the material rather damp, so he laid it out in front of the fire to dry. A few days later, George Vickers sadly died, having suffered with symptoms that were unlike any others that his friends and family recognised. 2 weeks later, someone else in the village died, and shortly afterwards so did another 4. The parish register shows that there were 6 deaths through September, and by the end of October there were 23 people who all developed those unusual symptoms and then died. It was only then that the villagers of Eyam started to make the link between the cloth, London, the plague there, and the deaths from these unusual symptoms in their village. Furthermore, it's likely that the London plague virus had flourished in the warm, damp conditions on the cloth, travelling up from London in the mild, late summer weather. Even more, old George Vickers had then increased the activity and transmission of the virus by laying the cloth out in front of his fire. The plague in London had paralysed the capital, and the wealthier Eyam families, or those with relatives living outside the village, left for fear that they too would become ill and die. Those who had no choice but to stay were worried that they were in danger. As much as possible, the members of the close-knit community kept their distance from each other, but the vicar, the Reverend William Mompesson, decided that they had a duty not only to protect themselves, but also those who lived in nearby villages. He urged parishioners not to trespass beyond the limits of a specified boundary, and between 300 and 400 villagers agreed to do what he asked, and to stay confined within their village, or at least that's how the story goes. Some sources suggest that the remaining villagers were forced to stay by the authorities, kept in a form of lockdown, you might say. However, if the risk of death from the plague wasn't enough, the villagers' plight was made even worse by the prospect of dying of starvation. So, the Reverend Mompesson enlisted the help of the wealthy local landowner, the Earl of Devonshire, who ensured that the village was supplied with provisions and medicines. These supplies were left at prearranged locations on the village boundary, so that the deliverer and the collector never met. As food and provisions made their way into the village, so messages of increased death rates were communicated out, left at the boundary in the form of notes, so that others were kept updated on what was happening in the lockdown area. Not quite a daily update to the nation on BBC One from a government minister, but the principle was the same. The fate of the villagers and the spread of the virus was of interest to those outside the Eyam boundary. And for those living inside the restricted zone, life was hard. Harder than perhaps the villagers had ever thought possible. it was not uncommon for whole families to pass away. Services inside the church were suspended for fear of the disease spreading, but services were held outdoors, where the congregation could separate themselves better. 11 months after the arrival of the cloth from London in August 1666, the virus was still spreading and the vicar's wife died. The mines were deserted, weeds spread through the village, and there was a sense of hopelessness. In September, after a year, the number of deaths started to reduce, and in October the last victim died. Bonfires were lit, and clothing, bedding and materials were thrown on the flames, the aim being to see the plague off once and for all. Over 13 months, 259 members of the Eyam community had died, amounting to 5/6 of the population of the village. The parallels with what we are going through now are obvious, and it's interesting to remind ourselves that we've dealt with rapidly spreading deadly viruses in the past. As human beings, however sophisticated we might think we've become, we are vulnerable to such things. Do watch Bill Gates' TED Talk of April 2015, when he explained just how vulnerable he thought the world was to a pandemic with uncanny accuracy. But also, how did the villages of Eyam cope 4 centuries ago? Well, they did much the same as we are. Those most at risk of infecting others self-isolated in order to protect the wider population, either through choice or possibly with a bit of state encouragement or even enforcement. They tried to spread out in bigger gatherings to avoid transmitting the virus, and neighbouring villages from a safe distance provided the support that they needed, just as charities are working hard at the moment to ensure that the most vulnerable in society have a minimum in order to live. And finally, after some tragic losses, huge tragic losses, the danger passed and Eyam started to rebuild. Science means that today we're better placed to cope than our ancestors were, however vulnerable we are. In time, the danger will pass for us too, and we'll come back together and move forward. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.